The judge was less than a minute away from ruling against me when a dusty cardboard box changed everything. I did not know it at the time. Sitting in that courtroom, I believed I was about to lose not only my father's estate, but also the last piece of his reputation. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 69 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and until that morning, I had spent nearly a year listening to people tell me that my brother knew our father better than I did. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, landing across polished wooden benches and stacks of legal documents. My attorney sat beside me quietly reviewing notes. Across the room, my brother Daniel looked confident. Too confident. He sat upright with his hands folded neatly in front of him, occasionally whispering to his lawyer. Every time I looked in his direction, I felt the same unsettling question return. How could he be so certain? Dad had always been a fair man. He repeated the same phrase throughout our lives. Fair is fair. He said it when we were children dividing chores. He said it when Mom passed away. He even said it during his final years when conversations about the future became unavoidable. Yet Daniel had spent months insisting that Dad secretly promised him everything. The house, the savings, the investment accounts, everything. According to Daniel, our father made that promise during a private conversation shortly before his health declined. There was no witness, no document, no signature, just Daniel's word. Somehow, that had been enough for many people. Family members who once greeted me warmly began avoiding difficult conversations. Some stopped calling entirely. Others politely suggested that perhaps I should accept Dad's wishes and move on. The problem was that I never believed those were Dad's wishes. Not for a single day. The hearing had already lasted several hours. Attorneys presented timelines. Financial records were reviewed. Witnesses testified about family relationships. None of it seemed to matter. Every piece of evidence felt incomplete. Every answer created another question. As the morning progressed, I watched the judge's expression carefully. Years of teaching children had made me sensitive to subtle changes in people's faces. I recognized the look. He was growing tired of uncertainty. He wanted a conclusion. And conclusions require evidence. Unfortunately, evidence was exactly what I lacked. During a brief recess, I stepped into the hallway outside the courtroom. The corridor was nearly empty. I stood near a window overlooking the parking lot and tried to steady my thoughts. I thought about Dad. I thought about the countless afternoons we spent drinking coffee on his back porch. I thought about his habit of labeling every box in his garage with thick black marker. Most of all, I thought about how disappointed he would be to see his children sitting on opposite sides of a courtroom. When the recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. The atmosphere felt different somehow. More final. More urgent. The judge reviewed several documents before speaking. My stomach tightened. Then something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened. A man I barely recognized entered carrying a weathered cardboard box. He spoke quietly with one of the attorneys. Within seconds, people began exchanging confused looks. Even Daniel turned around. I watched as the box was placed on a nearby table. Old labels covered its sides. Dust still clung to the corners. Nobody knew it yet, but inside that ordinary box rested the one thing my brother never expected anyone to find. And for the first time in months, I felt a small spark of hope. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The arrival of the box had interrupted the steady rhythm of the proceedings, and uncertainty seemed to spread through the courtroom like a sudden change in weather. The man who carried it forward introduced himself as Walter Jenkins, one of my father's longtime neighbors. I recognized him immediately. He had lived 3 houses down from Dad for nearly 20 years. Walter looked uncomfortable standing there, as though he wished he were anywhere else. The judge asked a few questions. Walter explained that he had been helping clean out an old storage shed behind my father's garage. The structure had been scheduled for demolition months earlier, but the project kept getting delayed. While sorting through forgotten items, he discovered the box pushed behind a row of dusty shelves. At first, he assumed it contained old household junk. Then he noticed my father's handwriting. That detail caught everyone's attention. My father labeled everything. Every holiday decoration. Every tool. Every extension cord. If he stored something, he marked it carefully. Walter explained that after hearing about the court dispute from mutual friends, he decided the contents might be important. As he spoke, I noticed Daniel shift slightly in his chair. It was a small movement, but enough to catch my attention. Until that moment, He had appeared completely relaxed. Now something seemed different. The judge granted permission for the contents to be reviewed. A court clerk carefully opened the box and began removing items one by one. Old photographs, tax records, instruction manuals, a collection of notebooks. Nothing remarkable. My brief surge of hope began fading. Perhaps this was simply another dead end. Another box filled with memories, but no answers. Then the clerk lifted out a smaller container. It was an old metal case with scratches along the edges. A label attached to the top read "Personal Recordings." The room grew noticeably quieter. I felt my pulse quicken. Daniel stared at the case without blinking. The clerk opened it and revealed several cassette tapes neatly arranged inside. Each tape carried a handwritten date. Some were more than 10 years old. Others were from the final years of Dad's life. My attorney leaned toward me. "Did you know these existed?" he whispered. I slowly shook my head. Dad had always enjoyed recording family stories. He occasionally used an old cassette recorder to preserve memories, especially after retirement. But I had never seen these particular tapes. The judge examined the labels before setting them aside temporarily for review. The hearing could not continue until everyone understood what had been found. As attorneys discussed procedure, my mind drifted backward through time. I remembered sitting on Dad's porch during summer evenings listening to him tell stories about growing up during harder years. He believed memories mattered. He believed people forgot too much. Suddenly, the existence of those recordings felt entirely consistent with the man I knew. During another brief recess, I remained seated while most people left the courtroom. Daniel stayed as well. For the first time all day, our eyes met directly. Neither of us spoke. His expression was impossible to read. Concern, irritation, worry, perhaps all three. Across the room, the metal case rested on a table beneath the watch of court staff. It looked ordinary, small, unimportant, yet something about it seemed to pull everyone's attention toward it. As the courtroom slowly filled again, one thought repeated itself in my mind. If my father had chosen to record his thoughts during those final years, there was a chance his own voice might soon become part of this case. And if that happened, the story everyone believed could change forever. The court adjourned early that afternoon so the newly discovered tapes could be reviewed properly. What should have been a routine continuation of the hearing suddenly became something much larger. As people gathered their belongings and slowly filtered toward the exits, conversations filled the room. Attorneys whispered to clients. Family members exchanged nervous glances. Everyone seemed to understand that the direction of the case had shifted, even if nobody knew exactly how. I remained seated for a moment after the judge left. The metal case containing the recordings sat across the room under the supervision of court staff. It looked remarkably ordinary. Just a scratch container filled with aging cassette tapes. Yet it carried more weight than any document presented during the previous months. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon air felt warmer than I expected. My attorney, Sarah Mitchell, walked beside me toward the parking lot. She had represented me since the beginning of the dispute and had witnessed every frustrating twist along the way. "Do not get your hopes too high yet," she said gently. "The recordings may not contain anything relevant." I appreciated her honesty. She was careful with expectations. Still, I could not ignore the feeling growing inside me. "Dad labeled everything," I said. "If he kept those tapes, they mattered to him." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That may be true." We stopped beside my car. "Either way, tomorrow will be interesting." After she left, I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. My thoughts drifted back to the years before all of this happened. Dad had always enjoyed preserving memories. Family vacations, holiday gatherings, stories about his childhood. Sometimes he recorded conversations simply because he feared details would disappear with time. I smiled faintly, remembering how often he would point toward his old cassette recorder and say, "One day somebody will want to know how things really happened." At the time, we always laughed. Now those words felt strangely important. The following morning, I drove to Dad's house before returning to court. The property had remained mostly untouched since his passing. Walking through the front door still felt difficult. His favorite chair remained beside the living room window. A pair of reading glasses rested on a small table nearby. Everything looked as though he might return at any moment. I moved slowly through the house until I reached the garage. The familiar scent of sawdust and old tools lingered in the air. Dad spent countless hours there working on small projects. Every shelf reflected his personality. Organized, labeled precise. As I looked around, another memory surfaced. Several years earlier, I had helped him clean part of the garage. During the process, he showed me a small shelf containing recording equipment, microphones, blank tapes, batteries. At the time, I paid little attention. Now I wondered how many recordings he had created. More importantly, I wondered why he saved them so carefully. My phone rang, interrupting the thought. It was Sarah. The court technician completed an initial review, she said. My heart immediately accelerated. And there was a brief pause. Several tapes contained personal recordings made during the last few years of your father's life. I gripped the edge of the workbench beside me. Did they listen to all of them? Not yet. Another pause followed. But one tape appears to contain a conversation specifically about family matters. For a moment, the garage seemed completely silent. Then Sarah added something that stayed with me the entire drive back to the courthouse. Evelyn, whatever is on that recording, your father clearly wanted it preserved. The question now is why. By the time I returned to the courthouse, the atmosphere had changed again. The building felt less like a place where a routine inheritance dispute was being resolved and more like a place where people were waiting for a mystery to unfold. Groups gathered quietly in hallways. Attorneys spoke in low voices. Even court staff seemed unusually curious about the recordings. I found Sarah reviewing notes at a small table near the courtroom entrance. She looked up as I approached. The technician finished listening to the tape we discussed, she said. And I asked. Sarah closed the folder in front of her. Your father was speaking alone. It appears he was making a personal recording. My pulse quickened. Did he mention Daniel? Not directly. She paused. At least not in the section we reviewed. The answer was both encouraging and frustrating. Minutes later, everyone returned to the courtroom. The judge explained that several recordings had been identified as potentially relevant. However, before any material could be introduced as evidence, authenticity needed to be established. Procedures, verifications, expert opinions. The legal process moved slowly, but for the first time, I did not mind. Every delay seemed to bring another piece of information. During testimony from the audio specialist, we learned that the recordings were original analog tapes created over several years. Dates written on the labels matched periods when my father was still living independently. Nothing suggested tampering. Nothing suggested fabrication. As the expert described his findings, I glanced toward Daniel. His expression remained controlled, but the confidence I had seen earlier was fading. He spent less time looking around the room and more time staring at the table in front of him. The judge scheduled a longer review session and recessed the hearing until the following morning. Outside the courtroom, reporters were not waiting. This was not that kind of case. Yet among our family, the interest was growing rapidly. Several relatives approached me for the first time in months. My cousin Laura was one of them. Evelyn, she said carefully, I never understood why you kept fighting this. I smiled faintly. Because I knew Dad. Laura looked down for a moment. I suppose that matters more than I realized. Her words stayed with me as I drove home that evening. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. Instead of going directly home, I stopped at the small diner where Dad and I often shared coffee after church on Sundays. The booth near the window was empty. I sat there for nearly an hour remembering conversations from years earlier. Dad rarely spoke about money. He cared far more about principles, fairness, responsibility, integrity. Those were the things he repeated again and again. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. About 5 years before he died, we were discussing a disagreement between neighbors. After listening patiently, Dad smiled and said, "The truth usually takes longer to arrive than a lie, but it travels farther." At the time, it sounded like one of his ordinary observations. Sitting there now, it felt almost prophetic. Later that night, Sarah called again. Her voice carried an energy I had not heard before. "Evelyn, there is something else." I sat upright immediately. "What happened?" The technician located another recording from the same period. My heart began racing. And there was a brief silence before she answered. "This one appears to reference family decisions directly." I stared into the darkness beyond my living room window. Somewhere inside those aging tapes, my father's voice had been waiting for years. And with every new discovery, it felt as though he was moving closer to telling us exactly what he wanted us to know. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. Sleep had been nearly impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined my father's voice waiting inside those recordings. Not because I expected a miracle, because I wanted certainty. For months, every conversation had revolved around competing versions of the truth. Daniel had his story. I had my memories. Somewhere between them stood a courtroom trying to decide what really happened. When I entered the building, I immediately noticed the difference. Family members who had avoided me for months now greeted me politely. Some offered small smiles. Others simply nodded. The discovery of the recordings had changed something. People were no longer certain they knew the entire story. That uncertainty mattered. Inside the courtroom, Sarah was already reviewing documents. She motioned for me to sit. The technician completed a detailed analysis overnight, she said quietly. Several recordings contain conversations about family matters. One appears especially important. My heart accelerated. Have you heard it? Sarah nodded. Only part of it. Before I could ask another question, the judge entered and everyone rose. The proceedings resumed immediately. The audio specialist returned to the witness stand and explained the restoration process. Most of the tapes were in surprisingly good condition. Age had created some distortion, but the recordings remained understandable. One by one, he described dates, storage conditions, and authentication methods. The process felt slow, but every answer strengthened the credibility of the evidence. Then the discussion turned to the recording Sarah had mentioned. According to the technician, it had been made approximately 2 years before my father's death. The label attached to the cassette contained only 3 words written in black marker. Family decisions. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. The technician explained that portions of the recording contained background noise that required enhancement. Some sections remained difficult to hear. Others were perfectly clear. Most importantly, the voice belonged to my father. There was no dispute about that. As the expert continued speaking, I glanced toward Daniel. His posture had changed noticeably. Gone was the relaxed confidence he displayed during the early hearings. He sat rigidly now, staring straight ahead. His attorney whispered something to him. Daniel barely reacted. For the first time since this case began, he looked uncertain. During a short recess, Sarah and I remained inside the courtroom. What exactly is on the recording? I asked. She hesitated. Enough to make people pay attention. That answer only increased my curiosity. When the hearing resumed, the judge approved a formal review of selected portions of the audio. However, before the recording could be played publicly, legal objections needed to be addressed. Attorneys debated procedure. Technical details filled the room. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Yet beneath those discussions, tension continued building. Everyone knew the same thing. We were moving closer to hearing my father's actual words. Not interpretations. Not memories. Not claims. His words. As the afternoon approached, the judge announced that the recording would be introduced during the next stage of testimony. A date was set. The courtroom slowly emptied. I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave. Then I noticed something unexpected. Daniel remained seated long after everyone else began leaving. He stared at the evidence table where the restored tapes rested. His expression was difficult to read. But for the first time, he looked less like a man protecting a promise and more like a man worried about what someone else might say. And somewhere inside those recordings, my father's voice was waiting. The hearing resumed 3 days later. By then, the recordings had become the center of everything. What began as a dispute over inheritance had transformed into a search for a voice from the past. As I entered the courthouse that morning, I noticed how different the atmosphere felt. People no longer spoke with certainty. Relatives who once accepted Daniel's version of events now seemed cautious. Questions had replaced assumptions. That alone felt significant. Inside the courtroom, the restored cassette tapes sat on the evidence table beside a digital playback system prepared by the court technician. Everyone's attention kept drifting toward it. The judge called the session to order, and after several procedural matters were addressed, the audio specialist returned to the witness stand. He explained that additional work had been completed since the previous hearing. Background noise had been reduced. Distorted sections had been enhanced. Most importantly, portions that were initially difficult to understand had become clearer. I felt my hands tighten slightly around the edge of my chair. Across the room, Daniel stared straight ahead without expression. The specialist began describing the recording labeled Family Decisions. According to his analysis, my father appeared to be speaking alone, likely using the recorder as a personal journal. The recording lasted nearly 40 minutes. Several sections discussed ordinary topics: household repairs, medical appointments, family memories. Then the conversation shifted. The specialist paused before continuing. Approximately 26 minutes into the recording, Mr. Parker begins discussing long-term planning and family expectations. A quiet silence settled across the courtroom. Even the attorneys stopped writing. The specialist pressed a key, and the recording began. At first, only a faint hiss emerged from the speakers. Then my father's voice filled the room. Older, slightly tired, but unmistakably his. Hearing it again after so many months nearly took my breath away. For a moment, I was no longer sitting in a courthouse. I was back on his porch listening to him talk over coffee. Several people glanced toward me. I kept my eyes on the table and listened. My father spoke about growing older, about wanting things organized, about avoiding confusion after he was gone. Then he laughed softly and said something familiar. Fair is fair. That is how I have always tried to live. The words sent a ripple through the room. I had heard that phrase my entire life. A few jurors exchanged quick glances. The recording continued. My father spoke about both of his children. He mentioned me by name. He mentioned Daniel by name. Nothing dramatic. Nothing shocking. Just reflections from a man thinking aloud about his family. Then the audio quality suddenly worsened. Static interrupted several sentences. The specialist immediately explained that this section had suffered significant deterioration over time. Frustration swept through me. We were finally reaching the part everyone wanted to hear, and now the recording was becoming difficult to understand. Through the interference, a few words remained clear. Property, responsibility, family. Then another burst of static swallowed several seconds completely. When the sound stabilized again, my father was still speaking, but the most important portion seemed incomplete. The courtroom remained silent as the recording ended. The judge looked toward the specialist. Is that all? The expert shook his head. No, Your Honor. Every head turned toward him. There is additional audio. A separate segment from the same recording session. We only finished restoring it yesterday. My pulse quickened instantly. The specialist looked toward the evidence table before speaking again. And based on what we have recovered, the next section may be the most important part of all. The courtroom remained completely silent after the specialist's announcement. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, as though everyone in the room is holding the same breath. The judge nodded for him to continue. The technician adjusted several controls on the playback system before explaining what had happened. According to his report, the original cassette contained damage near the end of the recording. For years, that section appeared unusable. Only after extensive restoration was it possible to recover additional audio hidden beneath layers of distortion. As he spoke, my attention shifted briefly toward Daniel. His face remained expressionless, but his hands were clasped tighter than before. For months, he had presented his version of events with complete certainty. Now certainty seemed harder to find. The technician pressed another button. A low hiss filled the room. Then my father's voice returned. This time it sounded slightly clearer than before. He was speaking in the same reflective tone, as though recording thoughts for no audience except himself. For several moments he discussed ordinary matters. Repairs needed around the house. Medical appointments scheduled for the following month. A neighbor who had helped him with yard work. Then his voice slowed. I have been thinking about the future, he said. The courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively. People make too many assumptions when money is involved. Another pause followed. The sound quality dipped briefly before stabilizing again. If there is one thing I hope my children understand, it is that fairness matters more than possessions. I felt my chest tighten. Those words sounded exactly like him. Not rehearsed. Not dramatic. Simply honest. The recording continued. Daniel works hard. Evelyn works hard. They are different people, but they are both my children. The technician increased the volume slightly as another section emerged from the restored audio. I never wanted either of them believing they deserved more because of pride or less because of distance. Several heads turned toward me. For months, Daniel's argument had relied heavily on the idea that proximity created entitlement. He lived closer. He visited more often during certain years. He claimed those facts justified everything. My father appeared to see things differently. Then came another burst of interference. The static lasted only seconds, but it felt longer. Everyone waited. When the audio returned, my father's next words arrived with startling clarity. The house, the savings, the investments. Those things should be divided equally. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the attorneys stopped taking notes. My father's voice continued. I have explained this before, but I want it recorded because memories have a way of changing when people want something badly enough. A quiet murmur spread through the room before the judge immediately restored order. My pulse raced. After months of arguments, assumptions, accusations, and legal filings, the simplest answer imaginable had emerged from a cassette tape hidden inside a forgotten box. Yet the recording was not finished. My father sighed softly before speaking again. If either of my children ever says I promised them everything, then they are mistaken, or they are choosing to remember only what benefits them. The words landed with unmistakable force. Across the courtroom, Daniel stared motionless at the table in front of him. For the first time since this ordeal began, there was no alternative interpretation. No missing context. No ambiguity. Only my father's own voice explaining exactly what he wanted. As the recording ended, the silence that followed felt entirely different from the one before. The mystery was disappearing. The truth was finally beginning to stand on its own. For a long moment after the recording ended, nobody seemed to know what to do. The words hung in the air with a weight that no argument could overcome. My father's voice had crossed years of silence to answer the question that brought us all into that courtroom. The judge looked down at his notes. The attorneys remained unusually quiet. Even the spectators appeared reluctant to move, as though speaking too soon might somehow disturb the significance of what they had just heard. I sat perfectly still, trying to absorb what had happened. Throughout the entire dispute, I had imagined countless possibilities. I worried the recordings might be unclear. I worried they might reveal nothing useful. I worried that memories and assumptions would continue competing forever. Instead, my father had spoken with remarkable clarity. Across the room, Daniel finally shifted in his chair. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Daniel responded quietly, but whatever confidence once fueled his case had disappeared. The certainty that carried him through months of hearings was gone. In its place stood a simple reality. The man whose intentions we were debating had explained them himself. The judge called for a brief recess before final arguments. As people slowly exited the courtroom, several relatives approached me. Their expressions carried a mixture of surprise and regret. My cousin Laura was the first. "Evelyn," she said softly, "I should have listened more carefully when you tried to explain." I smiled gently. "You were listening to what seemed believable at the time." She nodded, but the regret remained visible. Others followed. An uncle, 2 cousins, family friends. Nobody offered dramatic apologies. They simply acknowledged what the recording had made impossible to ignore. The truth often arrives quietly. During the recess, I stood near a courthouse window overlooking the parking lot. The afternoon sunlight reflected from rows of cars below. Sarah joined me carrying a folder. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. "Relieved," I said. "And sad." She nodded as though she understood immediately. "Because it should never have come to this." I looked out the window again. Exactly. This was never about money. It never had been. If my father had genuinely wanted Daniel to receive everything, I would have respected that decision. What I could not accept was a version of reality built upon claims that contradicted everything I knew about him. The courtroom eventually filled again. Final arguments were surprisingly brief. The evidence spoke louder than any attorney could. Sarah focused on the recording, the authenticated restoration process, and my father's repeated commitment to fairness. Daniel's attorney attempted to argue that intentions can evolve over time. It was a reasonable point, but no additional evidence existed to support that possibility. The most direct statement available belonged to my father himself. When the arguments ended, the judge announced that a ruling would be delivered before the close of the day. A quiet tension settled across the room. The long journey that began with a claim and a promise was finally approaching its conclusion. As we waited, I found myself thinking less about the estate and more about my father sitting alone with a cassette recorder years earlier. Somehow, he had anticipated the possibility of confusion. Somehow, he understood that memories could become unreliable when mixed with grief, pride, and self-interest. And somehow, he had left behind exactly what was needed. Not a legal strategy, not a victory, just the truth. The judge returned shortly before 4 o'clock that afternoon. The courtroom rose as he entered, then settled back into silence. By that point, the tension felt different from earlier in the case. The uncertainty was gone. What remained was anticipation. Everyone knew the evidence had changed the course of the proceedings. Now we were waiting to hear what that meant. I folded my hands in my lap and looked toward the bench. Across the room, Daniel sat beside his attorney. He appeared exhausted. Not angry, not defeated, just tired. The past several months had taken a toll on all of us. The judge reviewed several notes before beginning. His remarks were calm and measured. He spoke about evidence, credibility, and the importance of documented intent in estate matters. Then he addressed the recordings directly. The restoration process had been verified. The recordings were authentic. Most importantly, my father's statements provided the clearest available expression of his wishes. Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of peace. It was not because I wanted to win. It was because someone had finally listened to my father. After months of arguments about what he supposedly said, the court had heard what he actually said. The judge concluded that the estate should be distributed according to the existing legal documents and the expressed intention reflected in the recordings. The assets would be divided equally, exactly as my father had described. The ruling itself lasted only a few minutes. Yet it brought an end to a conflict that had consumed nearly a year of my life. When the hearing officially concluded, people began gathering their belongings. Quiet conversations filled the room. Some relatives approached me. Others approached Daniel. Nobody celebrated. Nobody applauded. The moment felt too personal for that. Sarah shook my hand and smiled. "Your father helped solve his own case," she said. I smiled back. That sounds like something he would do. After leaving the courtroom, I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. For the first time in months, I felt as though I could breathe normally. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Daniel standing several feet away. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he looked down at the courthouse steps and sighed. "I did believe some of what I was saying," he admitted quietly. I studied his face. There was no arrogance left there. Only regret. "I know," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I should have listened better." The statement was simple, but it carried more weight than a lengthy apology ever could. We stood there for another moment before going our separate ways. The relationship between us would not heal overnight. Some things require time. But at least we were no longer arguing with shadows and assumptions. That evening, I drove to my father's house one last time. I sat on the back porch where we had shared countless conversations over the years. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. Birds moved between the trees. Everything felt familiar. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I found myself thinking about the old cassette recorder that had preserved his voice. For years, those tapes sat forgotten inside a dusty box. Yet when the moment arrived, they delivered something far more valuable than money or property. They delivered clarity. My father used to say that fairness mattered more than possessions. Sitting there beneath the fading evening sky, I finally understood what he meant. The estate had been settled. The case was over. But the real inheritance he left behind was not found in a bank account or a deed. It was found in the truth he chose to preserve, and in the reminder that honesty has a way of surviving long after we are gone.